Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
As regular listeners may be aware, I'm not only a former assistant director, but before I moved to LA, I served as a combat camera officer with the U.S. Air Force. And in honor of Veterans Day, I try to host episodes about topics where film production and the military intersect. Today, we're talking about Navy public affairs in Hollywood. And my guest is Jon McBride, who served as an officer with the U.S. Navy from 1964 to 1968. Jon, welcome to Below the Line.
Thanks, Skid. Good to be with you.
Jon, I'm also glad you're here. Before we get to the connection with Hollywood, I know we've teased that for our listeners. Talk to me about what motivated you to join the Navy and how things started out for you back in 1964.
Okay, I was going to graduate. I did graduate from college in June of 1964. It was a time when I didn't have a clue what to do after I graduated. My best friend from high school, his dad was a retired rear admiral in the Navy. My friend, had gone to the University of North Carolina. I was at Yale. He decided he was going to go in the Navy Officer Candidate School, OCS. I said, well, I'll do that too. That was my motivation for going in the Navy. It was a time fraught with concerns about military service for students, graduating students who were concerned they were going to get drafted as a war in Southeast Asia was heating up. But that didn't really faze me. I don't know how seriously I thought about it. But interestingly, when many would have been thrilled to fail the physical to get into the military and be relieved of duty, I failed my first physical to get into the Navy for reasons that I did not agree with. And I told the Navy in no uncertain terms. And so they gave me a second physical, which I passed with flying colors and was finally sworn into the Navy on my birthday in June of 1964.
So Yale was our other connection. And while I did ROTC in school, and that's what led to me joining the Air Force, you didn't do ROTC. You mentioned going to OCS. Tell us more about that and how that timed out for you.
Okay, I did not do ROTC. And OCS was Officer Candidate School. It was 4 months of school in Newport, Rhode Island. It was quite rigorous in training, both sort of academics in the machinery of the Navy and also military discipline and whatever. And, it happened in the fall of 1964 in Newport. And I took it fairly seriously. I gained an appreciation for classical music while I was at OCS because we had to spend a lot of time shining our boots to make them look really snappy. And it was sort of like doing so in a cattle car because there were just a lot of people around doing the same thing. So I retreated to a particular closet and I had a small radio and I could tune into WQXR, the classical radio station from New York City, wafting across Long Island Sound. And I'd listen to classical music while I shined my boots, and I became quite a fan of classical music. On a weekend, on occasion, I would have leave and I could jump in a car, borrow a car, and run down to New Haven and catch a football game or something. It was sort of an adventure. As opposed to a intellectual commitment to military service, if I were honest with myself.
And what was the plan for you? Like, I know in 64, things are ramping up in Vietnam and as far as U.S. involvement there. What was your plan post-OCS? What did you think was going to happen?
Well, two things. One, I signed up, as I say, for the Navy in June of 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin incident allegedly happened in late July of 1964, and I went into Officer Candidate School in August of 1964. So the Navy I went into and the Navy I signed up for were dramatically different. I, of course, did not know that at the time. So at the end of the 4 months, we were commissioned as ensigns, as officers, and given our orders to duty. And I was asked, did I have preferences? I said, yes. I don't care what sort of ship you put me on. I don't really care what job you give me. I'd like to be on the East Coast, Norfolk, Virginia, or north. I don't particularly want to go to the Deep South or Southern California. And soon my orders came in, go to communications school in Newport, Rhode Island, and then go to shore duty as a communications officer for an air wing of the Naval Air Forces in Norfolk, Virginia.
Sounds ideal.
I thought this is pretty nifty. I've got a nice convertible. I've got friends up and down the East Coast. This will be kind of fun to do my military duty. And a couple of weeks later, I was called in, McBride, your orders are here. I said, I know. I'm going to comm school in Newport and then to the air wing in Norfolk. Oh, no, those orders have been scrapped. Your orders now go to Georgia for school for 4 months and then go to San Diego to join an aircraft carrier. The Deep South and Southern California. I wasn't sure I was crazy about that. In fact, I thought, I wonder if I could get a string pulled if I went to my friend and asked if his father could, get those orders changed. But then I thought, I don't want to go to the Deep South and I don't want to go to Southern California. Why don't I let someone else pay my way and go find out what it's really like instead of what I think it's like? So I relaxed and said, I'll take my orders. And again, I went to Glencoe, Georgia, where I had 4 months of school. After 3 months, it turned out I was the only officer there with orders to a particular brand new class of the Navy Tactical Data System, which was computerized air warfare, anti-submarine warfare, and electronics countermeasures, something for which evidently I had aptitude but zero interest. But since I was the only officer with orders to that class, they said no. And we're sending you to San Diego. There's another school. There are more officers with similar orders. You'll do your last month of school there and then join the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk, CVA 63, in San Diego, actually in Coronado across the bay at North Island Naval Air Station. It was one of the largest then. The USS Enterprise was CVA 65. And it was just coming on stream. And around then, as I recall, it was the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. The Kitty Hawk was one of the last large conventionals. It was CVA 63. The USS Constellation was CVA 64. And the Kitty Hawk and Constellations were sister ships.
And so, as I understand it, you spent about 18 months with the Kitty Hawk. But tell me how much time you spent doing Navy tactical data systems and what that transition was like for you on the ship.
Well, when I went on the ship, I was in the operations department in the CIC, the Combat Information Center, was where I stood my watches, which were 4 hours a day. And it turns out there were 8 junior officers assigned to that, 2 of us at a time on duty. And so we had to work 4 hours a day, and then we had to keep ourselves sane the other 20. I know I had been trained to do it, and I guess that was good, but I was not particularly interested. And about 3 or 4 weeks into my tour on the Kitty Hawk, I was having dinner with another junior officer in the junior officer dining room. In the Navy, it's a wardroom, the junior officer's wardroom. He was the public information officer. And I asked him, what do you do? And he told me, I said, I'd like your job. And he said, well, why don't you ask for it? I'm leaving in 3 weeks. And I thought that sounded really interesting. So I said, who do you ask? He said, yes, the executive officer. And I was brand new. The executive officer is the number 2 officer on the ship under the captain. I was so brand new, I didn't know who the executive officer was. Like, who's that? And he told me how to find his office. And I went down to see the guy. And I remember I sort of tapped on the door and opened it, said, sir, I'd like to talk to you for a minute. Do you have a moment? He says, as I recall, he said, you have a tongue that goes up and down, young man, get in here and use it. So I said, yes, sir. And I went in, sat down. I said, sir, I'd like to volunteer to be your public information officer. Now, I know you know, I'd like to think you don't know, but you do know. I've been trained by the Navy to be a CIC officer, but I don't think that necessarily makes me a better qualified to be a CIC officer than to be your public information officer. And I'd like to tell you why. And I sat there and think, did I just say that? What? And after about a half an hour of chatting, he says, "Well, McBride, I'm glad you took the time to come in and tell me this." He said, "Usually I can't get anybody to take this job. You're my fourth volunteer. So I'm going to have to think about this, and I'll let you know." And a week or so later, he called me into his office and said, "McBride, you're my man. I've decided to put you in as the public information officer." Said, "That causes a little bit of a wrinkle." I said, "How is that?" He says, "Well, at present in the CIC department, you report through to the operations officer. He is one of 6 or 7 department heads that report to me, the executive officer. I am also one of the department heads that reports to me." He said, "I am the department head of the executive department in which public information sits. So I am basically taking you out from under one other department head, operations, and putting you under the department head of executive department, which is me. And the operations officer is not very happy with me for doing that. So this is the compromise we worked out. Instead of, as my public information normally would, standing your watch 4 hours a day on the bridge, basically helping to drive the ship, you're going to continue to stand your watches in the CIC department, but you'll still be part of the executive department in your title." I said, "Yes, sir."
So, John, so you're doing both. Basically, you're still reporting up through operations, but then you're doing the public affairs duty on the USS Kitty Hawk. What did that public affairs duty involve?
Interestingly, at the time it was called public information. Now it is called public affairs, and that happened while I was on the Kitty Hawk, that official change in the title. But the job was a number of things. Number one, there was a newspaper on the ship every day, came out of the public information office. I was responsible for that getting done right. I had a full-time sailor assigned to that. There was a young man, graduate from the University of Texas, really neat young man, and he did a good job of that. So I had to just be sure it happened. When the ship went on a cruise, for example, from San Diego to the Western Pacific, there was a cruise book put together, and that's a pun, cruise, for the cruise in the Western Pacific, and cruise, it belonged to the crew. And it was kind of like a college yearbook. And someone had to be sure that got put together right and was ready when the ship returned from its cruise. That came under the public information officer as well. And then, and the critical part of the job was when guests of the Navy would come to the aircraft carrier, particularly if we were, well, on shore, but particularly if we were at sea and they came in on a small plane, someone had to greet them at the plane and take them by the hand and be sure that they saw what they needed to see and that they didn't fall overboard and they didn't bother the captain, or when there was an admiral on board, when there was an air wing on board and the admiral was there, that the guests didn't bother them. And that was part of my job. That was a very interesting part of my job, actually, to meet some of the people that I wound up meeting. One example, while I think of it, we were sailing around and we had a guest that came from Hollywood, Martha Raye. I don't know if you remember the comedian Martha Raye, but she came out to visit. She was staying in the admiral's at sea cabin because the admiral was not on the ship at that point. And I remember at one point a phone call in my little stateroom. The phone rang and yes, and this is Martha Raye. "I want a ham sandwich." I said, "Yes, ma'am." It's 1:30 in the morning. And I thought to myself, how do you find a ham sandwich on an aircraft carrier at 1:30 in the morning? Well, I went down to the cruise dining area, to the kitchen, and told them my plight. And they were very good about putting together a nice ham sandwich for me. And I took it and delivered it to her in the captain's at sea, or the admiral's at sea cabin, and all was well. But another time, the Secretary of the Navy had a program of sending civilian guests out to sea for several days. They were called, very imaginatively, SecNav guests. And one time, a group civilian. They were generally business leaders or retired military, whatever, coming out to get a sense for how the Navy was working these days. At one point, a group of, as I recall, 8 or 10 SecNav guests came out, and the Navy Department had sent an escort officer with them, a retired rear admiral who was an aviator. And I had thought to myself, sooner or later, the conflict between the operations department and the executive department was going to come to a head. I didn't know when, but my sense was that the guy that I wanted to prevail had the most power, so I was comfortable that sooner or later it would resolve in my favor. Well, this is when it happened. We were working, going around the ship. I was showing these guys all around, being their escort, and it came time for me to go stand my watch. And I said to their escort officer, Admiral, I said, Admiral, I've got to go stand my watch. I'll get someone else to be with you as escort officer while I'm the 4 hours. I'm like, no, John, I want you to stay with us. I said, Admiral, when you have a watch in the Navy, you stand your watch. And he says, John, I'll take care of it. And he disappeared. And he came back, and after not too long says, John, no problem. You don't have to stand your watch. You're staying with us. And I said, oh, that's nice. And so I did. And that night, I think I got another in the middle of the night request, this one from the operations officer to show up in his office on the spot. Yes, sir. I got up and went to his office. And he announced, again, it was about 2 a.m, said, McBride, as of 0700 tomorrow morning, you are no longer in the operations department. You are in the executive department full time. And I said, yes, sir. And I closed the door to his office and looked around. There was no one there. And I jumped up and clicked my heels and said, yes. I was no longer standing my watches in CIC. I now had to stand my watches on the bridge. So I was free now of operations and free to be the public information. And maybe by then it was the public affairs officer full time.
But John, tell me, so it's one thing to be doing public affairs for the Kitty Hawk, but how did you manage to transition into doing public affairs full time for the Navy, given that they instill invested in you with your training and operations? Talk to me about sort of the events that led to you making public affairs your focus.
Well, actually, that's a first-rate question because it leads right into my thinking at the time. I thought to myself, I really like doing public affairs for the Navy, and I think I can do it well. And I'd rather do it on shore than at sea if I had a choice. So I made a conscious decision, literally an intentional decision. I said, I will tell anyone who will listen that I would like to do public affairs and I'd like to do it on shore instead of at sea. I'll make a complete fool of myself if necessary. But sooner or later, I'm going to tell somebody who can do something about it. I may not know that, but I'm willing to make a fool of myself to get the message out. And one day, and this is a bit further down the career, because the Kitty Hawk was at this time steaming in circles 50 miles off the coast of North Vietnam as the air war for the naval air forces was ramping up. And a group of ABC TV news cameramen, as I recall, came out to the ship from Saigon, and they had an escort officer with them also. And as I showed them all about, and at one point, their escort officer and I sat down for a cup of coffee. And I figured, here I go again. I told him, I really like doing this public affairs, and I'd like to do it on shore if I had a choice. And he said, well, McBride, I'm glad I came out here and met you. I like what I see. I'm the guy in the Pentagon who assigns those jobs. And I'm surprised that people back in the United States couldn't hear my jaw hit the table. Wow, what? Well, the message had landed, and it was about 9 months later. The Kitty Hawk had come back and was in the States, but it was preparing to go back over to Vietnam for a second time. And I took some leave and I went back from the West Coast to my hometown in Washington, D.C. My parents had moved to New York in the ensuing years, but my grandmother still lived there. And I went to visit her. And I decided, I'm going to go over to the Bureau of Naval Personnel in Arlington, Virginia, and talk to the detailer. What was the title of the officer that assigned Navy officers to their positions, wherever they were. And I said, I'm going to talk to my detailer, the guy who has my file, and see if I can persuade him to get me off the ship and to do public affairs on shore. And I'm going to take an ally with me because the original executive officer who had made me his public information officer on the Kitty Hawk had subsequently been promoted to full captain and stationed back at the Pentagon. So he was there, and I had reached out to him, and he said, I'll go with you to your detailer because I think it would be a great idea if they assigned you an onshore public affairs slot. You did a great job for the Kitty Hawk and for me. So he and I sat side by side across the desk from my detailer and tried to make our argument why I should be taken off the Kitty Hawk and assigned public affairs duty on shore. The detailer listened, and in spite of the fact that he was a two-stripe lieutenant and my old boss was a four-stripe captain, he said, ain't no way this is going to happen. McBride had a 3-year obligation to us. He has 1 year to go. The Navy trained him to the tune of, I don't know, $50,000 to be a CIC officer. He's not leaving that ship. He's on that ship for the next year until he's through with his service. And the captain, my old XO, and I kind of shrugged and gave up and said, well, you gave it the old college try. That was in the morning. In the afternoon, I was back at my grandmother's apartment, and I picked up the phone and decided to call that escort officer who had come out from Saigon with the ABC TV news guys. And I called him. His name was Harry, and he answered the phone. I said, Harry, it's Jon McBride from Kitty Hawk. And he said, Jon McBride from Kitty. Oh, yeah, Jon McBride from Kitty Hawk. I remember. What's going on? I said, well, I'm on leave back here in Washington. I just thought I'd call you up and remind you who Jon McBride from Kitty Hawk was in case something comes up. And he said, well, would you like to go to Hollywood? And I remember putting the phone, sort of picking the phone up and looking at the phone. Did I just hear what he said? And I said, well, do you have anything better? And then I covered the phone with my hand so I didn't start shrieking. And he said, no, John. He says, I need someone to go to the Navy Public Affairs Office, West Coast. It said on Sunset Boulevard, across from the Screen Gems lot at Gower Street. He said, I need someone who knows Navy public affairs. You've been doing it for a year and a half, and knows Navy aviation. You're on an aircraft carrier, so you know Navy aviation. Can you get off your ship? And I said, sure, but I'm going to need your help. Remembering the conversation about 4 hours earlier with my detailer, there is no way you're getting off this ship. And he said, don't worry, I'll take care of it, John. I know where your replacement officer is, just graduating from a journalism school at the University of Indiana. I'll take care of it. I said, thank you, sir. Went back to the Kitty Hawk in California, understanding that I was soon to get orders to Hollywood. The ship was preparing to go back to Vietnam. And the date got closer and no orders. And they got closer, no orders. So I took a chance. I had a friend who lived in suburban San Diego in La Jolla, and she allowed me to leave my car with all of my earthly belongings in her garage while we set sail. And I had a couple of changes of clothes and a lot of high hopes that I would be back. If I didn't get those orders, it was going to be a long cruise with 2 changes of clothes. And we start steaming across the Pacific Ocean. We are approaching Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and I still don't have orders. And I'm really puzzled. What am I going to do? And as we approached Pearl Harbor very early in the morning, I got up very early, and I went up and I got some binoculars, and I looked on shore. And there, among all these officers in khaki and white uniforms, was a sole officer in dark blue, navy blues. And I said, you don't wear blues in Hawaii unless you come from back east. That's got to be my replacement. And the ship pulled in, tied up, and this guy came tootling up the ramp And I sort of hustled over. Hello, who are you? He says, I'm here to replace Ensign McBride. I said, yes. Well, I was concerned because I still didn't have orders. So I went down to the personnel office of the ship and asked if I could borrow the telephone, knowing how precarious a phone call from a ship was, because it went through the ship switchboard, and then it went through the Pearl Harbor Navy Station switchboard, then it went back through the Pentagon switchboard. And in those days, along anyone could have just pulled a cord and the car was disconnected and I was toast. But I called this guy back at the Pentagon. I'm going to say his name was Harry. And he answered the phone. And I said, Harry, this is Jon McBride and on the Kitty Hawk. He said, oh, yeah, John, how are you? I said, I'm great. We're in Pearl Harbor. We're on the way to Vietnam. My replacement officer has just come aboard the ship. My problem is I don't have any orders. And as I said that, I got a tap on my shoulder. And I looked around and there was this sailor. He said, excuse me, USS McBride? I said, yes. He said, I have some orders for you, sir. I said, thank you. I said, wait a minute, Harry. And I read through them. I said, Harry, my orders just arrived. Thank you very much. Hung up the phone. So now I had my orders and we're in Hawaii. I said, well, maybe I'll be just, I'll leave the ship and fly back to California. All will be well. So I went to the then executive officer of the ship, my current boss. Guess who he was? He was the former operations officer who I figured was still mad at me for having been taken out of his department and made the public affairs officer under his predecessor, executive officer.
Oops.
But in fact, it turns out, while we perhaps didn't like each other a whole lot, there was a sense of mutual respect. I think he appreciated the fact that the public information, public affairs job for a line officer in the Navy was not his favorite thing to do. It was a lot of administrative stuff. And if he had someone who liked it and did a good job with it, it was making it life a lot easier for him. And I think I did that. So I went to him and explained, sir, I've just gotten orders to leave the ship. And my successive officer is here. He said, well, that's nice, but one of the responsibilities of the public affairs officer is to get a cruise book put together for us on our cruise. And you did it last time and did a great job. I want you to go with us on the ship over to Japan on our way to Vietnam again. And in fact, get us another contract for a cruise book publisher. I said, yes, sir. So I went across the ocean further to Japan. And it was actually pretty neat duty.
Yeah, that didn't sound so bad, John. That sounds like a pretty nice gig for a little bit there.
Well, in fact, the common business practice, and perhaps it still is, for doing business in Japan at the time was the companies that would like your contract were very generous sort of hosts. And we had some nice dinners and things talking, different publishers, and finally went back to the same publisher that was an absolutely terrific company. It published, among other things, the Asia edition of Time magazine at their international division in Tokyo, and got a contract for several $1,000s less than I was authorized to pay. So I was thrilled, and I think the executive officer was even happy with me. Got the contract, so I was all set to go, and it came time to depart the ship. This was a little bit of a story in its own right, because it was Thanksgiving Day in 1966, and I had a nice Thanksgiving dinner on the ship. And then as I proceeded to depart for the last time, the Navy tradition is there's a guy with a little whistle, McBride, departing as the farewell to an officer as he leaves. Well, in this case, it was epic. McBird departing, and I had to smile and say, farewell, Kitty Hawk. And I went down the ladder, and there was a little limousine waiting to me and whisked me up to Haneda Airport in Tokyo. And I climbed on a Pan Am 707 to fly back to California. And we took off about halfway across the Pacific, across the international date line. And it became Thanksgiving Day again. And they served us a nice Thanksgiving dinner on the plane. Oh, I landed in Los Angeles swapped planes, flew down to San Diego, and there was my friend waiting for me at the airport. And she said, "Hurry up, John. We got to get home, get you cleaned up. We got to go out for Thanksgiving dinner." And I found that I was going out for the third Thanksgiving dinner in about a 40-hour Thanksgiving day. I remember after dinner going back to this young lady's house and just crashing for 14 hours. But the transition had been made. I was back in California, and I took that car that was in her garage, drove up to Los Angeles, had a friend who was living at the beach in an apartment. He was willing to share his apartment with me until I found a place, which I did next door. And it was the transition was done. I was now ensconced in Southern California as a bachelor living in the beach and driving 11 miles each way to my office in Hollywood from Playa del Rey.
John, before we get into your specific stories, explain to our listeners kind of what the role and intention of having Navy Public Affairs West Coast was. How did the Navy interact with Hollywood, and what did both want from the other side?
It's a good question, because a lot of people would hear, "Oh, Navy office in Hollywood. Is that where they make your Navy training films?" And in fact, the answer was no. There were two Navy offices in Hollywood, one that was inward focused on making films for the Navy, training films and those kinds of things. That was not our office. Ours was externally faced, and we would work with both the motion picture industry in Hollywood, television and radio stations in 8 Western states. As far as the film liaison, if a film production company wanted to make a film that had Navy ships and Navy people in it, they pretty much had a choice. They could buy, build, or rent a ship and outfit it to look like a Navy ship and hire a cast and get them costumes that look like Navy costumes and try and train them to act like they were in the Navy. Or they could borrow such a ship, fully staffed and uniformed, from the United States Navy, the Department of Defense. To qualify for that, since most film production companies opted for option 2, they would have to submit the script for their film to the Navy Public Affairs Office, West Coast. And we would read it and send it back to the Office of the Chief of Information, the Navy Chief of Information, with a recommendation: either cooperate or don't cooperate. And the Navy Office of Chief Information was called CHINFO. CHINFO would read it and send it on to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs with a recommendation: cooperate or don't cooperate. And the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs would read it and then would send it back to CHINFO saying cooperate. Could also say don't cooperate. But in this case, cooperate and assign a project officer. CHINFO would then send it back to the Navy Public Affairs Office, West Coast, and tell the senior officer there, cooperate, assign a project officer. At the time, the office was run by a 3-stripe commander and 3 of us junior officers. The commander would get that kind of a instruction from CHINFO and would assign one of the 3 of us, or perhaps would do it himself, to be the project officer to work with a film production company. On the television and radio side, it was quite different. From the radio point of view, as the war had ramped up and was very active, and we dealt with a lot of radio stations in small rural areas of Montana and Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Arizona, Utah, we could offer to them the fact that in our office we had reel-to-reel. That was the state-of-the-art recording, the 1960, reel-to-reel recordings of body counts as read by correspondents in Saigon. And they could tap into it by telephone and stream it out their radio station as though they had people on the beach, or at least access to current military activity in Vietnam. So they were very grateful to hear from us, to know that they had that kind of coverage, and they had someone to talk to if they had a question about what was going on in the military in Vietnam or anywhere else. So it was up to us to develop relationships with the personnel at the radio stations in those 8 Western states. On the television side, the television stations all had public service requirements to broadcast X number of hours of public service broadcasting every week. And so we in the Navy had at the time a series of 28-minute full color films, 28 minutes being filling a half an hour for a TV station that was about life in the Navy, in the military. It was good public relations for the Navy, and it would help fill their requirement for public affairs broadcasting. They could run it at 2 a.m. if they want to. That was up to them. But we would send them these films in packages with a return mailer. So all they had to do was open it up, stream it out through their TV station, put it back in the mailer and ship it back to us, postage paid. So it was a good deal for them, and it was a good deal for us. In fact, part of my job was to set up meetings with the news directors of the TV stations throughout, again, Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, California, Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. I mean, it was fascinating for a city boy from Washington, D.C. to jump on an airplane and fly to Helena, Montana, hop off the plane, and there was a Navy little truck waiting for me and drive around Montana and calling on TV stations and being, greeted as a welcome guest and just get a sense for what life was like, and also providing a public service to the broadcasters in there. That was fascinating.
Now, John, going back to the approval of film scripts, when we were chatting earlier, it came up. One film done at the time was Yours, Mine, and Ours, starring Lucille Ball and Henry Fonda, and it's set on Naval Air Station Alameda. That film came out in 1968. I'm assuming that came through your office. Any stories about that one?
That film did come through our office, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. The commander who ran our office was the project officer. He thought that was a pretty nifty one for him to keep to himself.
Privilege of rank, choose that job for himself.
But I knew about it. And I have to admit, as a fun story, one night, a friend of mine from Yale and his wife, he was an attorney on his way to a conference in Hawaii. And they flew out and they had a stop in Los Angeles and reached out to me and said, let's have dinner. So the three of us went to dinner at a nice restaurant over in Beverly Hills. And as we sat at our table, I looked over at the bar and saw sitting there at the bar alone, Henry Fonda. Now, Henry Fonda did not know me from a broomstick, but I thought to myself, I'm going to have some fun with my friends. And I said to them, excuse me a minute, I want to go say hello to a friend. And I walked over to the bar and I said, excuse me, Mr. Fonda, my name's Jon McBride. I work at the Navy Public Affairs Office, West Coast here in Hollywood. And I know you worked with the boss on Yours, Mine, and Ours, but I heard a lot about it. And I just wanted to come over and introduce myself to you. And we just chatted for a couple of minutes. And I said, thanks, appreciate it. And I walked back to my friends whose eyes were the size of pie plates. Oh my goodness, John, Henry Fonda. And I said, well, and at some point, as I recall, now it's been 60 years, so I might be making this up, but I recall that Henry Fonda got up as he was leaving and he came over to the table and said, John, nice to see you. Glad you stopped by. And my friends almost fainted. I cannot tell a lie again. I told them the truth after Mr. Fonda had left, but it was a lot of fun to pretend.
Now, John, well, you might not have been involved with that film particularly. Tell me about some of the other projects you were involved with.
The projects that probably took more of my time than anything else was a particular TV show that was filmed on naval stations. I think through late 1967 into 1968, as I recall. As I recall, it was broadcast from January of 68 to January of 69. But we had put together many of those shows before I left the Navy in the middle of 1968. The show was called Operation Entertainment, and it was basically a musical variety show, the kind that, and this will date me and perhaps some of your listeners, it was very reminiscent of the shows that Bob Hope would assemble and take overseas to the troops, particularly around holiday times. Variety shows with musicians and entertainers that they all knew, and it gave them a sense of being, around home for a little while. So ABC had decided to put this show together, and it ran once a week, I think, for 26 weeks, is my remember. Maybe it was every other week for 26 installments because it lasted a full year as they broadcast it. At any rate, my job as the project officer was to accompany the production team to the naval installation and see to it that potentially clashing cultures meshed. I can give one good example. One of the shows was going to be filmed on an aircraft carrier in San Diego and in Coronado, California, the USS Constellation, which was CVA 64, as I had said earlier, was a sister ship to the Kitty Hawk. So I knew how the ship was laid out. I knew who the different titles of the officers were. I knew what their job responsibilities were. And when the production company from Chuck Barris Productions, which put this Operation Entertainment show together, they gave me their list of what they needed from the aircraft carrier. I could look at it and pencil beside each request what officer on the ship could produce it for them. And so I went to San Diego to the Constellation and went to the executive officer. And as I went into his office to introduce myself, I could tell that he was about as tense as a violin string, thinking about this group of people with long hair and sort of Hawaiian shirts and bell-bottom trousers coming into his culture where everybody's wearing denim pants and chambray shirts and short hair. He could anticipate massive disruption of his routine, trying to figure out what they needed and how to provide it. Well, I was there. I said, sir, because I had been public affairs officer in your sister ship, I understand who does what. Here's a list of what they want. And beside it, I penciled which officer can provide it. My only request of you is allow me to speak to those officers in your name and request that they do it. And this XO visibly relaxed. It was like he had just been given 6 gallons of ice cream of his favorite flavor. Yes, you have my permission, young man. So we had really a fascinating time putting this show together on an aircraft carrier. Again, one little aside. Again, it was one of my side duties. It turned out I didn't know it. That one of the talent on that particular show was the singer Dionne Warwick. And she was there the day before taping for the rehearsal. And she came to me at one point and said, Lieutenant, I was a lieutenant by then, Lieutenant McBride. She said, there's a guy here on the other side of the fence who says he has permission from the Pentagon to interview me. And I'm not sure what to do. And I said, Dionne, I am your agent for a day. I'll take care of it. And I went over and I found this guy and talked, and it turns out he was a complete sham. He had no permission from anybody, but he was pretty clever in how he tried to approach Dionne Warwick to get an interview. But I remember thinking, being Dionne Warwick's agent for a day, and it wasn't all bad duty. I didn't really sign up for it, but it was a lot of fun.
And when we were talking earlier, John, you also told me you did an event with Ray Charles.
Oh, that's right. And another show, and I think this one was maybe at Port Hueneme, the civil engineering base. Ray Charles and his band were part of the talent. And on the day before, when we were rehearsing, I remember, and I thought to myself, what an incredible privilege. I was literally leaning on the piano, listening to Ray Charles and his 16-piece band rehearse. And at one point, Ray Charles raised his hand up and said, stop, saxophones, play those last 3 bars. They did. He said, second saxophone, where's the D? You're right, Mr. Charles. I was playing G. Okay, let's do it again. And I was just stunned. Out of 16 pieces, this gentleman, not sighted, could hear and pick out the part, the instrument, and the note that was missing. Stop it, get it repaired, and pick back up again. Extraordinary.
What a surreal experience there, John. Now, the Operation Entertainment was produced by Chuck Barris, who was also known for the dating game and the newlywed game. I'm curious kind of what grew out of that and what sort of relationship he had with the military and the Navy specifically.
Again, an interesting question, and I'm not sure where their connection came from. But another assignment I got was when Chuck Barris Productions said they wanted to have one of the Navy Blue Angels, their model flying ace pilots, just extraordinary what they could do with their airplanes. Wanted one of the Blue Angel pilots to be on the dating game as one of the bachelors and needed an escort officer. So sure enough, I took the guy over and was there as they, worked with him, did his show and all. It was kind of fun. They at one point afterward, they said, "Hey, John, why don't you come on and be one of the bachelors?" I said, "No, no, my job's to be in the shadows. I'm in the background. I'm not one of the principals here. Thank you." So I took a pass on that. But it was fun both to see the dating game being made in person and to meet the Blue Angels and just to again get a taste for a different side of the Navy itself.
So, John, honestly, for being in uniform and serving in the military, it sounds like during your time in Hollywood, you're having a blast. How do things wrap up for you in the Navy come 68? How do you make a decision to leave the Navy and how did your transition out work for you?
Well, it's interesting you would phrase it. How do you make the decision when you leave the Navy? Because in fact, the Navy pretty much decided when I came in and when I went out. Because originally I had gone to LCS in August of 64, was commissioned in early December of 64, and therefore I had a 3-year commitment. So I would come out in December of 1967. When the operation in Hollywood came up, I had the choice. I could accept the job in Hollywood and extend my obligation by 6 months, or I could pass up the job in Hollywood and stay on the carrier for another year. How long do you think it took me to make that decision? That was a really good trade-off. That was 6 months I was happy to offer up. And so as we came into 1968, I knew that my time was going to come up in June. And I was working with Operation Entertainment, as I recall, pretty much through the spring. Interestingly, I had signed up, as I say, on my birthday, June 16th, 1964. And I was supposed to get out 4 years later. And by that time, I was a full 2-stripe lieutenant, and I had some unused leave. And when I left, the Navy would have the opportunity to reimburse me for the leave I had not taken based upon my longevity in the service. And so the Navy thought it would be a good idea if I were to depart the Navy Public Affairs Office West Coast on June 15th, 1968, rather than June 16th, 1968, because they only had to pay me for my unused leave as a full lieutenant over 3 years of duty rather than a full lieutenant over 4 years of service. So I left the part of the service on June 15th of 1964. I thought it was still a pretty nifty birthday party. I was ready to go back to civilian life.
So, John, as we mentioned at the outset, you served from 1964 to 68. Any reflections on your military service over the subsequent years?
It was an interesting time to be in the military. And I know a number of my peers, classmates that were in the service and came back were not treated very well by a public that was very anti the Vietnam War. I was sufficiently intermeshed with the civilian world that I didn't experience that quite so much. But one interesting sort of thread followed me over the years. I came out in 1968, and it was, believe it or not, 1984. I went to my 20th reunion in college, and a classmate of mine had quit his job, full-time job in Northern California, and had moved to the Boston area as part of a grassroots educational movement that was called beyond war, a new way of thinking. Many people thought it was an anti-war group. It was not. There was a big distinction between being anti-war and being beyond war. To be anti-war, you got to have war around to be against it. To be beyond war, you've got to have moved beyond where war is considered a reasonable option to resolve conflicts because of the implications of continuing to resolve conflicts through warfare. And my friend came to our 20th reunion and made such a compelling argument and put on a demonstration which literally rearranged my internal landscape. And I said, I've got to know more about this and talk more about this. And I spent much of the next 7 years sort of studying beyond war, engaging with volunteers, and maybe there were 10,000 of us around the country at its peak, and doing a great deal of public speaking about beyond war. And to my great surprise one night, as I went to an event to be a speaker about beyond war, was with whom I shared the podium. It was my former second executive officer boss from the Kitty Hawk, the man who had been the operations officer when I got pulled out of his department and then made the executive officer, and I worked directly for him. And we were both surprised when we met on a podium talking about beyond war. And it kind of closed a loop, for my sense of military service. I had great respect for the tradition and what it's meant to our country over the years. And I also had come to the conclusion, given what we as a species know how to do now, to exterminate all of life, and we continue to behave 80 years later as though we didn't know that, at our own peril. But with no less respect for the military doing what its assigned job is, I realized that we had moved beyond war as a means to resolve conflict, and it was something that we needed to talk about collectively. And running into my old boss from the USS Kitty Hawk was actually a very heartwarming kind of conclusion, if you will, to my military duty another 15, 20 years later.
Well, John, that is truly a full circle there. On that note, we're going to call it a wrap. This was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you being here and sharing these stories today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the invitation to talk with you, Skid. It was a lot of fun to bring up memories from 60 years ago. I don't have many opportunities to do that. Thank you.
Great fun. Bula bula. One last postscript. My father passed in 2020, but his birthday was Veterans Day, and these episodes always serve as a nice opportunity for me to reminisce. He was a 30-year Army veteran, and he loved going to the movies. But when it comes to my own affection for film, he planted the seeds. I miss him. Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. My email address is skid@belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. As you may have noticed, the release schedule this season is sporadic, but if you need a fix between new episodes, there are more than 270 past episodes in the archive. You can peruse them at our website, belowtheline.biz, or wherever you get your podcasts. Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. If you want to support us, consider a purchase. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Other ways you can help. First, give us a positive rating wherever you get your podcasts. Second, tell your friends about an episode you enjoyed, because that's how we gain new listeners. All of that aside, whatever your engagement, the fact that you're still listening means a lot to me. Thanks again from Below the Line.